shadows. He didn't respond to their calls or take part in the group's routines. The bond that once united the leader with his pride had vanished. He only showed interest in the cubs. With them, his behavior was strange, but tender. Park workers began documenting everything. Jack played with the little ones. He cared for them and watched over them with dedication. It was a touching and unsettling image, a dominant lion who protected the cubs, while rejecting the adult females. Nothing in his behavior aligned with what was known about lion hierarchy. Some began to speculate. What if he blamed the lionesses for his brother's death? What if he saw them as a hidden threat? Others believed the trauma had disconnected him from the natural order, that what remained of Jack was no longer a lion, but an anomaly, an unpredictable being born of pain. And then, everything changed. After a successful hunt, the lionesses returned with a fallen prey. It was a routine ritual. The pride fed in an invisible hierarchy. First the dominant male, then the females, then the cubs. But this time Jack didn't approach. He watched from a distance, motionless. He waited until everyone had moved away from the carcass. And then he came closer. What happened next was quick and silent. While one of the lionesses rested, Jack pounced on her without warning. The attack was precise, lethal. He didn't roar. He didn't hesitate. He simply knocked her down and sank his fangs into her neck. In seconds, life was gone. The pride didn't have time to react. And Jack, before the stunned eyes of the park workers, began to devour her. No one in the park had ever seen anything like it. It wasn't a fight for dominance, nor a territorial defense. The lioness hadn't challenged him, hadn't provoked him. It was a senseless act, brutal with a dry kind of violence, as if Jack weren't hunting for centuries, but punishing. The lion has been a symbol of nobility. The rangers decide power to officially name him Jack. Its image killer from another time, like a predator who follows no flags of empires. From that day on, what happens fear when that very symbol breaks? Not among them. When the king of the jungle loses his mind and attacks his own kind. This is the story of a different lion, a predator that broke all the rules, a male who didn't prey on antelope or zebras, but on his own companions. It all began in Kruger National Park in South Africa, a natural sanctuary where life and death dance every day under the same sun. There, in 2017, a group of workers discovered something that defied everything they knew about lions. On a silent night, the usual roars turned into screams of horror, and when dawn revealed the traces of chaos, it was already too late. The story of Jack had begun. A lion with no name who would soon become a legend. But not a legend of greatness. One of blood, of madness, and of questions no one dares to answer. Though some claim it was all a hoax from anonymous forums, the evidence remained. The bodies, the scars, and the empty gaze of a lion who, for reasons we may never understand, destroyed his own legacy. Now let us journey to the heart of Kruger, and together discover the lion who went too far. Kruger National Park is vast, unforgiving, and beautiful. With nearly 19,000 square kilometers of wild territory, it is one of the last refuges where great predators still rule as they did millennia ago. But even in such a well-studied and closely watched place, there are nights no one can explain. Nights like that one in 2017, when the usual roars turned into heart-wrenching cries. It all started near a ranger station, a strategic point where workers usually rest after long patrols. Nearby, A pride of lions had settled, seemingly ordinary: 2 dominant males, 3 adult females, and several cubs. They had never been officially recorded, so they had no names. They were simply known as the lions of the station. That early morning, the roars woke everyone. At first distant, like echoes of a territorial clash. But soon, they became screams of combat, of pain, of something wilder than usual. The workers, experienced as they were, knew that fights between lions were not unusual. Sometimes it was young males trying to take control, other times intruders being violently expelled. That's why the workers chose not to intervene. They watched the dark sky and waited for sunrise. When the sun peeked over the horizon, the savanna gleamed with an unsettling stillness. Then they set out, guided by the remnants of roars still floating in the air. What they found left them in silence. In a clearing lay the lifeless body of one of the 2 dominant males in the group. His fur was covered in dried blood, and his ribs showed the brutality of the attack. Near him, the other male lay breathing heavily, covered in deep wounds, on the brink of death. But that wasn't all. A few meters away, 2 more bodies, adult male lions, also lay dead. They were intruders. No one had seen them in the area before. Everything indicated that during the night, a brutal battle had taken place between 2 rival groups. And of the 5 lions involved, only one had survived: the wounded male, the one who, a week later, would start being called Jack. The workers began monitoring him more frequently. They believed his injuries would eventually kill him, but they didn't. Over the following days, the lion began to recover. He limped, but he walked. His eyes had changed. They were no longer those of a protector, but of an animal that had seen too much, and carried something no one else could understand. On the surface, the group remained intact. The females cared for the cubs, and the surviving male lingered nearby. But something was different. He no longer roared with authority. He showed no affection toward the lionesses. Only the cubs seemed to spark some kind of connection in him. Everything else slowly turned into distance, and then into terror. As the days passed, the wounded lion, now known among the rangers as Jack, began to move with greater agility. His body was healing, but his mind seemed trapped in that night of blood. Experts hoped that once he healed, he would resume his role as dominant male. But Jack was no longer the same. Something had broken inside him. Instead of approaching the lionesses as was typical, Jack began to avoid them. He didn't growl at them or attack them. He simply ignored them, as if they were. They say that in these lands, there once lived a lion who devoured his own harem. Some laughed. Others fell silent. And then there were those who had seen the look of true fear. They simply nodded in silence. The most disturbing part? Since then, there have been sporadic reports of solitary lions with similar behavior. Isolated cases, yes, but enough to spark a chilling question. What if Jack wasn't an accident? What if he wasn't insane? What if he was simply the first to change? The first to shatter the noble mask of the king, to reveal the real predator beneath. In the animal world, what doesn't serve vanishes. What doesn't adapt, dies. But Jack adapted, in his own way. He broke from the past, destroyed his own pride, and survived, even if only briefly. His story forces us to look again at the lion, not as a symbol of honor, but as a mirror of something older, darker, and more primal, the fight to exist, no matter the cost. And so, while the sun still rises over the savannas of Kruger, and other lions roar into the wind, Jack's echo remains, in the bushes, in the silences, in the stories told by firelight, not as a glorious legend, but as a warning, because in the jungle, even the king can lose his crown. And when that happens, there is no order, there is no law, only instinct and blood. In biology textbooks, the lion is the symbol of balance, the just leader, the protector of the group. But Jack's story reveals something deeper, something more real, more brutal, that even the king can break, that even the fiercest predator can become an outcast, and that sometimes the most terrifying thing is not the violence, but the inexplicable. Jack did not kill out of hunger. He wasn't defending territory. He wasn't looking to mate. He struck from silence, from trauma, from a dark corner that even science cannot explain. Some will say he was just an anomaly, others that he simply lost his mind. But the truth is, since that night in 2017, no one ever saw Jack again, and no one could forget what he did. Maybe he went off to die. Maybe he's still alive, wandering through shadows, remembering those he devoured. Or maybe, just maybe, Jack was the beginning of something greater, a silent mutation in the soul of the hunter. Because when order breaks, the wild does not forgive. There is no justice. There is no redemption. Only the story remains. And now, you're part of it. Thank you for joining us in this chronicle. If Jack's story left an impact on you, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to keep exploring the wildest and sometimes darkest corners of the animal kingdom. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, the jungle watches, whispers his name, and the earth holds the echo of his steps. Jack's disappearance didn't bring peace. It brought questions. None of the rangers ever saw him again. His body was never found. No new attacks were recorded. It was as if the land itself had swallowed him. But his story did not fade. On the contrary, it grew. It spread among park workers, safari guides, and eventually into the dark corners of the internet, where legends take on a life of their own. Some claim to have seen him, wandering alone, with a ragged mane, and a lost gaze, like a ghost moving through the brush. Others said he had been killed, and devoured by other lions, nature's way of correcting what had gone wrong. But no one could confirm anything, because Kruger, despite its maps and drones, remains a place full of deep secrets. Official records never mentioned a lion named Jack. To the park's administration, it was simply an extreme case of anomalous behavior, a rarity, a deviation with no clear explanation. But to those who witnessed it up close, it was much more. Jack wasn't just an aggressive lion. He was a living shadow, a rupture in the logic of nature. Over time, his story became a warning. Guides whispered it to curious tourists, not as fact, but as legend. Territory Jack patrolled. Her instincts told her this was her last chance. If she stayed, she would not see another sunrise. But Jack saw her. From the top of a nearby hill, the lion spotted her among the shadows. He didn't roar. He didn't charge. He simply descended. With quiet determination. Within minutes, he reached her. The lioness tried to defend the cubs, but there was no fight. Jack wasn't an intruder. He wasn't a rival. He was part of her story, of her life. And in that final moment, he would also be her executioner. The attack was swift, silent. No one witnessed it, except the cubs, who watched, with wide, speechless eyes. When it was over, Jack stood still. He looked up at the sky, and then walked among the bodies, as if nothing had happened. Now he was alone, completely alone. In the days that followed, Jack wandered with the cubs, but the group was no longer a pride. It was a ruin. Two of the little ones, too young to survive without their mother's milk, died of malnutrition. The others began to weaken. Jack, though he protected them, could not feed them. His presence was no longer enough. And then the inevitable happened. Another group of lions, strong males, females, and cubs, entered the territory that had once belonged to Jack. There was no fight. Jack did not roar. He did not defend his land. He simply watched. And then, like a wounded ghost, he vanished into the tall grass. The cubs, necessity. He did it after eating. He did it when hunger was no longer present. He did it as if fulfilling a dark destiny. The last lioness understood what was happening. She no longer looked at Jack as a leader. She watched him like one watches a ghost. Her posture was submissive, but also fearful. She didn't challenge him. She didn't approach. She hunted alone and fed the cubs in secret, avoiding any direct contact with him. The park workers watched everything with anguish. They wanted to intervene, but interfering with natural events went against Kruger's policies. Still, many debated whether what they were witnessing was truly natural. Where was the line between instinct and madness? What happens when a predator stops following the rules of its own species? Jack, for his part, continued to be gentle with the cubs. He played with them, guided them through the brush, protected them from hyenas or jackals that lurked in the distance. It was as if he had divided the world in two, the innocent and the guilty, and to him, the lionesses seemed to have crossed an invisible line, one that no one else could see. With each passing day, the tension grew. The rangers knew Jack would not stop. The final act was coming. The question wasn't if he would attack again, but when, and whether anything of him would remain after that. The last lioness of the group knew she was doomed. Not because Jack had attacked her yet, but because his gaze said it all. What had once been indifference was now surveillance. Jack no longer ignored her. He observed her carefully, in silence, as if waiting for the exact moment. The clever lioness changed her behavior. She hunted alone, ate far from the pride, and returned only to feed the cubs. The little ones were still alive, unaware of the horror. They approached Jack without fear, played around him, cuddled into his mane. He didn't push them away. Sometimes he even licked them, with tenderness. It was an unbearable contradiction, the killer of the mothers, being at the same time the guardian of their young. It defied all understanding of pride dynamics, but the tension was unsustainable. On a moonless night, the lioness tried to escape. She didn't flee in desperation, but in silence. She guided the cubs with caution, moving away from the humans, but within the pride itself. The lionesses began to look at Jack with distrust. The cubs, not understanding, continued to play around him, but the atmosphere had changed. Something dark had settled into the group, and everyone knew the worst was yet to come. After the first attack, the balance was broken. The once cohesive pride became silent and scattered. The two remaining lionesses kept their distance, ever watchful. They knew Jack was no longer their protector, but a latent threat. Still, life on the savannah doesn't stop. Hunting was still necessary, and the cubs depended on them. So cautiously, the females tried to maintain the routine. A new hunt took place days later. The lionesses returned, with a fallen gazelle, killed through effort and teamwork. As before, Jack observed everything from afar. He didn't intervene. He didn't assert himself. He seemed almost apathetic to the scent of blood. He waited until everyone had finished eating, and then he repeated his pattern. With slow steps and cold eyes, Jack approached one of the lionesses, resting under the shade of an acacia tree. She looked at him but didn't run. Perhaps she thought the first attack had been an accident. Perhaps she believed that madness doesn't strike twice. But she was wrong. In a single motion, Jack lunged. There was no roar, just a sharp, dry moment, and then the sound of flesh being torn. The second killing was even more disturbing than the first, because now could no longer be seen as a slip or a show of dominance. Jack had established a pattern. He was hunting his own companions, and he wasn't doing it out of